Great. Great. Well, it's nice to be here and to get a chance to talk with all of you today. So I was just looking at the breakout sessions; they look amazing. I was like, yeah, there literally are like four of them that I wish I could attend. Maybe I'll see if I can sneak into a few. But anyway, it's really great to be here and to get a chance to talk to you. My name is David Chalial. So great job on the pronunciation. I am a sociologist who's based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So that's where I am right now. I'm speaking to you from my office, I guess. I'm looking out the window here. It's a beautiful day. We finally got rain after about 2 weeks of none at all. Anyway, feels like a good day today. So really happy to be here. So today, let me just throw this slide up one moment. And here we go. I'm going to share my screen. I think we're just about there. Great. So can you all see the screen right now? Yep, I see thumbs up. That's a good sign. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about some work that I've been doing for about 20 years now, although it's amazing to me that it's been that long. So I'm going to tell you about three different projects, actually a number of different projects with three different kind of combinations of projects. And so as a sociologist who's interested in making photographs and making films about contemporary social issues, it's really important to me to have the opportunity to talk about the work in this way and not just simply, do something that's going to show up in an academic journal or something, but instead to really engage with the public, engage with students, engage with all sorts of people. And so again, it's just really exciting to be here with you, as these three photographs might actually look familiar to some of you. So one of my collaborators is the World Affairs Seminar's academic dean, Michael Carrier, and I'll talk a little bit more about that project at the end, although I understand you've had the opportunity to hear from him about that project. So why don't I start kind of like from the beginning here, and tell you a little bit about sort of what I do and why I'm doing it before we get into some of the specific projects. And so, I'm a sociologist, and for those of you who haven't encountered sociology as a discipline, sociology is often thought about as the discipline that studies society. We can often think about it as being a companion kind of discipline to disciplines like anthropology, which are about studying culture, economics, which is about studying the economy, or political science is about political systems. But at least from my perspective, the really compelling thing about sociology is that it's really an interdisciplinary field. And so it's a field of scholars who are doing work with historians, doing work with anthropologists, doing work with whomever, and in conversation then with all sorts of things. And so this is why, as a sociologist, I really see my work in photography and film as being helpful, as being part of a dialogue that is happening within academia, but also, as I said, really, really importantly, outside of it. And so I'm motivated by all sorts of theoretical approaches, but what I want to emphasize here is that a lot of the work that I do is connected to something called grounded theory. And basically what this means is that I'm interested in looking out at the world and seeing sort of like the way that meaning is revealed in place. And so whether that be through the ways that people connect with each other, or through the way that I might, in this case, think about like observing a city. In this case, this is Camden, New Jersey, which is just outside of Philadelphia, for those of you who know where that city is. And to try to think about how certain kinds of understandings about what's going on in society can be revealed in that place. And so with this approach, I've engaged a whole host of problems that are often related to inequalities. So here, this is a time sequence of photographs from Baltimore, Maryland. The first one taken about 3 years before the second. And so the idea of making these individual images, but also sometimes these paired images, and you'll see more than paired images, is a way of trying to bring change, bring time, bring something else into these images than what you see in any particular moment. And so I really see this work as I hope is pretty clear. While it's about inequality, it's also about inequality at the intersection of what we might think of as community, or the way that social groups come together to create these sort of durable, long-lasting sets of connections and support, and the built environment. And the built environment is for the most part just a fancy way of saying, sort of thinking about the kind of environment that human beings have created. Often we might think about this as being work that's connected to architecture and so on. And in this case, we're looking at photographs from Chicago with the demolition of a major public housing development, and Belfast, Northern Ireland, in an area that is primarily occupied by Catholics. And so my interest in thinking about community and place in relationship to inequality is then thinking about how all of that manifests, how that like all really comes together and emerges in relationship to a variety of local social conditions. And so I want to tell you a little bit about the sort of like the overarching problem I see with that I'm interested in, and some of the data that can help us contextualize some of these images, and then bring us back to a bigger conversation. So we're not just talking about any particular site, any particular event, any particular moment, but we're talking about how these things can be connected to these much bigger questions that are happening nationally and internationally. And so theoretically speaking, this sort of question is about what is that relationship between community and place? And so particularly, as I said here, it's about that urban context of social and economic segregation. So it's about place, it's about inequality. And I'm interested in the way that groups are sort of divided from each other, sometimes legally, sometimes through other kinds of informal social practices, or the kinds of things that aren't written into rules, right? But are written into the way that we create life. And I'm interested in that relationship. And so from a background of this, of course, I'm drawing from all these big pictures, sociological theorists and economists and so on. But a lot of what I'm doing is really about what's happening in a place, what's happening in a community. And so with this in mind, I've worked on all sorts of projects. And so some of them are like this one, which is thinking about how the connections that people have with each other are affected by what's going on in their communities. And so in this case, I was interested in a group of events that I call public traumas. These are events where there's some sort of catastrophic thing that emerges in the environment. This could be things like fires. This could be things like, when someone has been seriously wounded. This could be, in some cases, even a building maybe being demolished, and these things that are traumatic for the community. And by which I mean that these are things that affect the way that people relate to each other, often in really negative ways, and ways that it may pull people apart because of the intense emotional connections or disconnections that emerge in those situations. But I'm also interested in the way that these environments can bring people together. And so I think if you can look at the lower right-hand corner image, or really any of them, then we don't have to get into the specifics that are happening in each of these places, that these crowds manifest. And when these crowds emerge, there's something special that happens in these crowds. I'm interested in how that affects the way that people relate to each other and how they might build community in the long run through these kinds of meetings. And as you heard a little bit from Michael Carrier the other day, and like I said, we'll talk about this a little bit, a lot of this is about how community is ultimately built, particularly when we can't rely on outsiders, right? So if we're dealing with an issue that's going on in our community, we don't really feel like that someone in charge is someone who can really help us. And so this could be because there may be concerns about the interests of authorities. It could be of government officials. It could be organizational representatives. It could be anyone. But the kinds of people you might normally turn to help address a problem, what do you do when you can't turn to those people? And so to give us a little bit of data here, a lot of the work that I do is in the United States, although you'll see where we wrap up, I do a considerable amount of work internationally as well. And so I want to just focus on a couple of things that are important backdrops to a lot of the work that I'm talking about here, particularly as we're going to get at demolition. And so this figure is from the US Department of Census and Census Bureau. And what it what it's looking at is it's looking at what we call real median household income over time. So what this means is this is all the income that comes into a house, right? So it could be parents, it could be grandparents, it could be people who are also living in that same residence, right? But are not necessarily related. But it's about bringing those people are all together in this particular place, and it's looking at what their income is every year. And the real piece of it means it's inflation adjusted. And so we're actually looking at how this changes over time. And then on top of that, we're seeing a couple of other interesting things, right? So this is all in American dollars. On one hand, you can see these kind of light gray bars, and those light gray bars are moments when there are recessions. And then the other big difference here is we're looking at this household income by race and Hispanic origin. And so what this means then is that we're looking at demographic groups, and we're looking at the way that different kinds of racial and ethnic groups have different kinds of incomes on average in the United States. And we're able to do that over time. And one of the things that is just so clear to me, or there are a number of things that are really clear to me about this chart, one of which, thankfully, we can see that things are steadily improving in terms of people's real income, is finally starting to make a little bit of an uptick after literally decades of almost static income. But the other side of it is that we're starting to see a widening, right? And so if you look at particularly towards those earlier years, so you look in the 1970s, for example, where we see, white, not Hispanic, all races, Hispanic of any race, and Black as categories, right? Then we see that the distance between these groups was actually a little bit tighter, was a little bit smaller than it is now. And of course, certainly we see the addition of the Asian category as well. And so this to me is part of the way that we can describe inequality and the way that it manifests in the United States. And so one way to do that is to think about these income groups and the way they relate to the way they relate to race and ethnicity. So one of the reasons for this difference, where we start to see that there's this expansion, has to do with the different kinds of opportunities that existed around housing. And so the map that I'm showing you here is a map from Chicago. It's from the source here is called the Redlining in America Project. And it's a project that's looking at a practice that was common in the United States and persists in different forms today, where real estate agents, insurance agents, and local governments more or less colluded to sort of say that certain neighborhoods in the city were okay to lend to if people wanted to get a home. So you could, if you might need a mortgage, you might need a loan in order to buy property. And it would say that there's certain ones that are okay to lend to and other ones that aren't. And in this case, I think the colors should speak for themselves in the sense that the red are the areas where basically no loans are going to happen. Yellow is a lot of caution, and then sort of blue and greens, things start to change a little bit there. But one of the important points to look at here is that these areas where people were denied access to mortgages were areas that were often parts of cities that were low income and were also populated by people of color. And so what we're looking at is the way that economic and racial segregation manifested in American cities, and specifically here looking at Chicago, the way that aligns or makes it difficult for different kinds of demographic groups to be able to find purchase in the broader economic sphere. Here we can also look at examples like the broader St. Louis area, and with the same kind of pattern here, right? So low income, particularly low income communities that are populated primarily by community of color are neighborhoods where you're seeing very little investment being allowed, right? And this is one of the reasons we can start to see this divergence happening, right? There are other pieces of it that are really important to think about, and I promise I won't show you a million more slides of data like this. But instead, I want to give you again, but I still want to give you this context. We're looking at here is this is data that's from the Federal Reserve. They have this sort of cheeky Fred interface here. But what we're looking at is data from the Federal Reserve as organized by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it's looking at one of the major ways that the economy has changed over that period we saw that income change happening in, right? So, and I can just go back a couple slides here to remind you here. So here we see this chart beginning in the sort of like late 60s, early 70s, and we start to see these important demographic differences in terms of economic, different kind of income and the way that segregation is playing out, right? And then here we're looking again, starting in the late 60s, early 70s up to today. What we're looking at is something that's really different. So it's not just looking at property. In this case, we're looking at access to jobs. And one of the things that we're looking at here that I've created for this chart is looking at all employees in manufacturing versus all employees in private service providing industries. And so what you can see here is this red line is service employment, and this blue line is manufacturing employment. And the reason that's so important is that a lot of the cities where I've been doing work and where Michael and I have done work are cities where these used to be the industrial powerhouses of the country. So these are cities like Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, Milwaukee, and others. It's not to say that there isn't still manufacturing in those cities, because there certainly is. And it's not to say that there isn't still manufacturing in the United States, because again, there certainly is. But if you look at what has happened to the nation's economy, that there's been a wholesale shift away from one of the predominant forms of employment being manufacturing to being that section being just totally overwhelmed by the expansion of the service industry. And with that comes this expansion of the service industry, comes all sorts of jobs. Some of them are jobs that have been around for a long time, jobs like attorneys and clerks and so on. But some of them are jobs that are a little more contemporary, at least in their scale: restaurant servers, people who are working in shops and so on. And there's a tremendous variation in the kinds of income that one can derive from those jobs. But the people who are often employed in manufacturing positions, manufacturing jobs, which are often really high-paying jobs with good benefits, right? But when those jobs have started to go away, and we can see, taking a look at this peak and in this period in the late 70s, early 80s, going down to where it is today, that as those people are looking for jobs in other industries, that means they're often looking in the service industry, and the kinds of jobs that they're appropriately skilled for in the service industry are not the same kinds of jobs that have the kinds of support that the manufacturing industry had, right? So we're thinking about, to go back to this income chart, we're thinking about economic stratification that's happening based on income and race, right? We're thinking about the way that property might play a role, in different kinds of equal access to property is going to play a role in affecting it. Now we're thinking about the overall presence of jobs in the economy and how those things are affecting possibilities. And in this case, we find that many of, for example, the Black Americans that moved from the American South in the 1960s to places like Detroit and Chicago and Milwaukee in the 1960s, in the maybe even as late as the 1970s, that when they arrived there, that they see that they're arriving there in order to work in these amazing manufacturing jobs, right? And then we're now seeing here that those jobs are on the decline. Finally, let's just think about these jobs in a broader context. We think about this idea of the Rust Belt. On the whole, what I want to show here with this is to say that manufacturing in general is declining as a source of employment in the economy, but it's also declining in relationship to the Rust Belt itself. In other words, it's saying that what's happening is that there is a problem where those jobs that were really good, right, are now leaving, and they're leaving the places in a way that need them the most. Okay, so where does all this take us? Back to some photographs, right? Often where this leads us, the solution to this problem is so often divestment and ultimately demolition. And here we can look at a photograph from Chicago and a photograph from Detroit. And so we can think about places like Detroit, where they've had these really high profile cases where the city of Detroit has spent literally billions of dollars demolishing buildings because of these dynamics that we're talking about, right? And what's going up in their place? Often nothing. And so what this ends up leaving is parts of some cities looking like this, right? Well, there's other parts of those same cities that have received that kind of investment are looking like this. And so let's get into some of these examples. And so, again, I told you I'm interested in visual sociology, that I'm trying to figure out how do we make that relationship between people, social structure, and place really clear. And my hope is that these images will help us get at some of these issues. And so one piece of this is to think about what I'm going to call distributed demolition. And so the projects I'm going to talk about today in relationship to this, so those that operate on a city scale, right? So these are things that are happening throughout the city, but they may have different consequences depending on where people are. And so when I first started working as a graduate student in Chicago in 2002, one of the primary issues, right, was demolition, right? It's the same kind of issue that it is today. And some of those issues were super high profile. So these were things like the Plan for Transformation, which is a national level program in a way, in the sense that it was funded by national dollars, that went into looking at public housing, in particular high-rise public housing. And it was literally the spending of hundreds of millions, and in fact, billions of dollars nationally, to demolish a lot of high-rise public housing and to replace it with different kinds of housing. Okay, and we'll talk about some of that later. But a lot of what's happening in the city is not just about those huge things, right? So about demolishing those high rises, but a lot of it's about these small scale demolitions that happen day in and day out throughout the city and have at least as profound consequences, right? So the idea here is that living in a neighborhood where the house down the block gets demolished and then another house down the block gets demolished and another house down the block gets demolished over a number of years. And as that happens, what starts to happen is the overall framework, the feeling, the sense, the sort of like quality of the community starts to change. And here, if we go back and we think about this idea of redlining, right? So these communities, often low-income communities of color, that were denied investment, that many of those communities are the same communities today that are experiencing the slow scale removal, the small scale demolition. And so back in the 2000s, as like an early graduate student, I started working on projects that related to this issue. And some of them are really abstract projects. These are projects like the isolated building studies. This is what's called a typological project. I started in 2006. I actually still work on it a little bit. And so it's a typology in the sense that I make a series of photographs. I photograph them all in the same way and photographing them of the same subject. And so the idea is I want to use a sort of a uniform composition of these photographs of these buildings that don't have neighbors, but were obviously built to have neighbors, right? So if you look at this building on the left, right, or for that matter on the right, you can see that these are buildings that were built to be, they're crammed in on a lot, right? That they're taking up the whole thing, but the space around them is unfilled. And the reason it's not is because of this demolition, because of divestment, because of these issues. And so, I'm photographing all over, in this case, the city of Chicago. And my hope is that by photographing these images, displaying them in this way, it can demonstrate so much about property relations, about structural disadvantage, and the way that it's related to things like racism and other forms of marginalization, but also about resilience, right? Because these buildings are still here, because these people are still holding on. And so this is a series that as I said, I've been working on for years. There are at this point about 700 photographs in the project of buildings that are all in this position. And so my hope is that we can really see, as a visual sociologist, the way how all of this upheaval has been written into the city. Now, also on this distributed demolition kind of way, I've worked on other kinds of projects that are a little more concrete, right? So concrete projects like this one. This is called To Be Demolished. It was supported by an organization called the Driehaus Foundation. And it was published by a website in Chicago throughout the year of 2012, where I started out by tracking more than 100 buildings that were going to be demolished that year. And so I would wake up in the morning and I'd look at all the demolition permits in the city and I'd go out and I'd photograph a couple of buildings. And so I started out by doing 100. By the end of it, I actually had photographed closer to 600 photographs of these buildings that were being demolished. And so one thing became really clear in this project was that buildings like some of these, when they were demolished, they were in North Side communities. They were in communities that are relatively well-to-do. These are tend to be white and Asian communities with relatively high incomes. And that when these buildings were demolished, that something else was going in its place. Whereas the demolitions of buildings like this, which in many ways are very similar to those buildings on the north side, right? But on the south and the west side cities, these are cities that are primarily, communities of color, primarily African-American and Latin American communities, that when they would be demolished, it was typically because of divestment. And so you can perhaps like the most effective way to like visualize this difference is the comparison of these two different sets here. So, in 2016, 4 years after I started that project, I went back to photograph 20 sites that were in the city that I had photographed back in 2012. And so, what did it look like? And so here what we're looking at are two clusters of buildings. These buildings on the left-hand side are from the south side of the city. And so this is one of the neighborhoods, or in fact, a number of neighborhoods that were redlined, right? So that were in those charts that I showed you before. Whereas I'm going to show you on the right side, these are these cities these are these neighborhoods that for the most part weren't redlined. And these are neighborhoods that, again, have much higher incomes, as I was describing. And so if you look at these are matched photographs. So this is the same address. So this is, 5533 South Princeton, taken in 2012, and then again in 2016. And you can see that for these houses on the south side, right, each of them, and in fact, for all the ones I went back to photograph, there was literally nothing in their place, right? It was a vacant lot. But I went back and I photographed so many of these buildings on the north side. Almost all of them were buildings that had other buildings in their place, right? Some of them were just as nice. Some of them were nicer. Some of them were, the conversion of, a two-story apartment building into just a one giant house. In the few cases where there wasn't a building on that place on the north side, it was because someone had bought the house next door and demolished it so they could have a side yard. Okay, so again, my hope is that we're using photographs to make clear these important social changes that relate to things like income, to race, to all sorts of other important dynamics that are happening. I will be returning to this project in next year, in 2022, on the 10th anniversary of first making the work, and we'll be able to see how this project changed over time, literally looking at hundreds of the same properties again and again. Okay, so concentrated demolition and local solutions. So in this case, what I'm going to do is the second kind of project is going to be one that's not just about this sort of like broad look of what's happening in the city, but it's a concentrated look at one particular neighborhood. And the photographs here are going to be photographs that are relevant to the film that you all are going to have the opportunity to watch in a little bit. And then you'll get a chance to, assuming everything works out just fine, talk to Deborah, one of the main sort of protagonists in the film, this documentary film, who also is a co-producer of the film with me. And so we'll get a chance to talk to you a little bit about that. But this is a project that's about a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. So again, one of those neighborhoods that was redlined, back in the mid 20th century. This is an African-American community. This is a Black neighborhood on Chicago's south side, a relatively middle-class neighborhood where the majority of residents who are homeowners owned their homes outright. So they didn't even have a mortgage. They weren't paying off a loan anymore. Although there are a number of other people living in the neighborhood too, there was a small public housing project, so a kind of subsidized housing or social housing project. And there also were some apartment renters. And so what happened in this neighborhood, and I don't want to tell you too much about it, because you're going to get a chance to watch the film, was basically this big company, in fact, a transportation company, a freight train company, looked, and this is, you can see it in the foreground, looked south and thought, gosh, wouldn't we like to have this neighborhood gone? Right? And literally to basically put a place where trucks, where shipping containers can be parked. And so what we're talking about here is not just about the gradual demolition of a building here and there, but instead really the swift and really literal erasure of a neighborhood. And for me, this project started back in early 2012 with that to be demolished project, right? Things are coming together. And so I was working on the project and I showed up to see this building on 56th Street. And it was being demolished on the same day that two other buildings were being demolished within eyesight. Now, I wish I had taken a photograph so slightly to the right here, but you could see that there were two other buildings being demolished at the same time. And, because of course I had been studying the way that demolition was happening in the city, I knew how unusual it was for that to happen multiple times. And so I started looking through my records and I found that there were other buildings from the area that were being demolished and they were kind of unusual buildings to be demolished. And so this one one, for example, is a building that was rated as architecturally significant. And so you can see this beautiful brick detailing up at the top, and there's some other factors that have been, or features that have been stripped away. But it was deemed an architecturally significant building. It was relatively old for Chicago, so it was from the 1880s. It turns out, demolished by a company that had a link to the train company back in 2009. So the train company hasn't made any public statement or anything back in 2009 that it wants to get into the neighborhood. It doesn't do that to 2012, but it had slowly been buying up and demolishing properties using these LLCs. These are companies that they really just used to buy buildings, but they hid who the real owner of the company was, right? So no one could know it was the train company that was doing it. It was only after the fact that I was able to figure out that it was linked to the train company by going through property records and looking at the shared attorneys that all of these small companies had. And so I could then connect this also to other projects. These are photographs that were from even earlier, back in 2006, that I made as part of the Isolated Building Studies project. And so you can see how these things are intertwining, right? So that history of redlining, that history of income inequality, especially connected to race, leads to a neighborhood where there's that gradual kind of demolition that's happening in the neighborhood. But people are still holding it down. This is where they live. This is their home. It's really important to them. And they're continuing to fight for it, right? But this is also the same kind of thing that makes this neighborhood an easy target for the train company to come along and say, well, maybe we want to do something else here, and maybe we don't really care what you think about it. And so it was just so clear that this is happening in the context of a vibrant community. You'll get a chance to see some scenes that are connected to these images shortly. But one of the things that was really important is I didn't want to just, it was really clear to me that I couldn't just make an outsider perspective project about this film, particularly because here I am, I'm a white guy with a connection to the University of Chicago, which is an institution that has a really tortured history with the South Side of the city. And so from the beginning, it was really important to me that I sat down with community residents to see if there was even an interest in making a project about this issue. And so ultimately, I see this as being a collaboration with residents, and particularly a collaboration with a co-producer, a neighborhood activist named Deborah Payne, who you can see sitting next to me on the stage here. This is actually a student workshop we were doing at the Full Frame Documentary Film Festival when the film premiered. And so again, if all goes according to plan, we'll get a chance to talk with her in just over an hour. And so this is an opportunity for us for Deborah and I to work together. She as a sort of a neighborhood activist, trying to figure out how to draw attention to what's going on in her community, but also how to figure out how to address what's happening there. And then me as a sociologist who's trying to figure out how to, again, draw attention to this particular issue, and also try to figure out why this is happening so that it can't happen again. And so, the film spans more than 5 years worth of work. And again, I don't want to say too much about it, but provides opportunities for us to see the way that the neighborhood changes, and to see the way that neighborhood relationships started to change from these in-person interactions to much more digital connections, and particularly is how the residents are fighting. Right. One of Deborah's major lessons that's highlighted in the film is about community engagement. And so she's interested in building relationships with neighbors and other people in order to find a way to try to not just fight back against outsiders, right? In this case, the train company in the city of Chicago, but instead to fight for community, to bring people together. And so much of what we've been doing with the film has been about that. And that's really the kind of like the core of the public presentation of the project. In other words, I really see this as revealing, we can think of like the kind of like the potential and the promise of community action. And so the version of the film that you're going to see later today, or just in a little bit, has not only played on international film circuits, but is also shown on national television in the United States. And so the version that you're going to see today was made for America Reframed, which is a program of the World Channel and PBS. So those are the big national broadcasters in the United States. So it's an hour-long version of the theatrical version. So it's a little bit different from the ones that people are seeing in theaters, in order to sort of like kind of condense the story. And the story really focuses on Deborah's and her neighbors' fight. And so I'm going to tell you about one more project here really quickly as a way of wrapping up so we can have time for some questions and answers. And so, this final category of projects I wanted to make sure that we talked about at least a little bit is this project that you've already heard a little bit about, which is the City Creative. And so again, I know you've heard about it, and so I'm not going to spend much time talking about this specific project, but I want to talk about it in relationship to these other issues. And so, back in 2009, in the midst of the last recession, the Great Recession, as you know him, the academic dean, Michael Carrier, and I started working on a research project about do-it-yourself attempts to address the problems that a community members see in their neighborhoods, right? And so this is the work that he and I were already doing in groups in Milwaukee, Chicago, and we saw in so many other places around us. And so our collaboration will ultimately sort of become would become the City Creative, this book that you see here, which was published just a few months ago by the University of Chicago Press. As I'm sure you heard from Michael, this is an opportunity for us to hold on, I see Deborah calling me here. And so I'm just going to send her a quick text message in case she worries that there's some sort of a problem. A second. Okay. Saw her call a couple times. Anytime that happens, let's make sure she knows what's going on. So, I know he presented the work earlier, but we worked on projects all over the country. And so these are projects like Candy Chang's Before I Die project, which is in New Orleans. This is a version, you may have seen a version of this in a neighborhood, maybe in your neighborhood. And sometimes this would say Before I Die. And then she had written these sort of lines in the chalkboard that would allow people in the neighborhood to write on the side of this derelict building what they wanted to do with their lives. And some of these things might be something like, hang out with Brad Pitt. Others might be to take their mother on a fantastic vacation. Others might be to have children, to find love, and to be able to sort of do those kinds of things. And again, so identifying sort of the desires, the hopes and dreams of what's going on in a community. To all sorts of other projects. I might give you an example in the lower left-hand corner. There's a group called Big Car, that's their name, and they're based in Indianapolis, Indiana, and they have taken over, they bought an old industrial building and have purchased some other housing in order to try to maintain affordable housing in the community while at the same time enhancing the way that arts education happens and arts programming happens in the city. And so this is literally about, communities rebuilding from those issues, whether it be like in the small community garden outside of Columbus, Indiana, to addressing important community and national issues like happens at George Floyd Square in Minneapolis. And so, to thinking internationally. And so as I kind of wrap up here, this also means looking at international models that address similar kinds of issues, but outside the United States. And so, I'm particularly interested in locally driven efforts that are about addressing deindustrialization, right? Those same kinds of issues that are happening in the Rust Belt in the United States, and the environmental consequences and so possibilities of places like coal production sites. So here we're looking at two photographs from, one is from Belgium and Chalial, Belgium, and this is a place called Demolition, France. And these hills that you see are not natural, that these are literally piles of debris that used to be under the ground, but are now above ground because of the coal mining process. And so in those places, we're seeing these really amazing community development initiatives, things like the Metaphone project in Lens, France. And in fact, I was just talking today with someone from Lens about some of the work that they've been doing that's not just on the site of these former coal mines, but other kinds of industrial sites. And this keeps creating a really amazing musical sculpture, but also amphitheater for performances in the region, to places like the Vector in Charleroi, Belgium, which is a sort of a cultural, community-led cultural project where national or international touring bands play. They have art galleries, they have a library, and it's really an opportunity for people to connect with what's going on, but to develop the way that the arts and culture can continue to build something in literally on the site of where these developments used to be. to thinking about places like the Tohoku region of Japan, which continues to rebuild from the 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and radioactive disaster. I'm here looking at a couple of photographs from the town of Tamaoka that was not only nearby the Fukushima plant, but also deeply affected, tragically affected by those events, but is in the process of rebuilding. Here I think about two particular projects that are a little bit farther up the coast. Another city equally affected by the tsunami and earthquake, but not as much by the radiation, a place called Ishinomaki, Japan. And so this place has these two amazing organizations working at. One is called Hashidura Common. One of the things that was clear right after the tsunami was that many of the places where small businesses worked were gone. And so one of the things that they did was they created a town square style development with very low cost for small scale restaurants and other community groups to do work in the community, provide an opportunity for economic development and for people to come together. Or a place like Ishinomaki Labs, which is this amazing project that was born out of necessity post the tsunami. All of the doors, or many of the doors in the buildings that remained, had swollen because of the water. And so the doors literally wouldn't close on people's houses. And so people got together in the community and started to make doors to, replace those that were there. And in the process started this project, which is now still going strong. They now work with a group of national and international designers to make furniture of all kinds. They're embedded in the community. They're deeply part of it. And they've recently branched out into a new sort of community center, into a hotel, into a restaurant, where they're trying to grow in this place. They're trying to fill that void, literally as well as socially. And so, as I think about those projects, I share them with you as hope, right? So we're thinking about these issues of demolition and how they operate. It's essential that we really look at and represent and discuss, right, the structural forces that produce these things like vacancy and dereliction and dispossession, and also, of course, address the natural processes that are being affected so much by human action. By, for example, addressing contemporary redlining and corporate overreach, by thinking about these projects that are so embedded in communities and addressing what's going on. And really, I think it's really important that we think about how we can actively support these like innovative community-based solutions. And so the hope that is it's not only addressing what's happening in a particular neighborhood, but can guide policymakers to what's next. And really also particularly at this, I think, really important inflection point of political change, not only in the United States, but in the world as a whole. So thank you.